Um, Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on when you see this. Classes, I'll say classes because this video lecture is going to be useful both for PG 1 second semester and for my PhD batch. I am teaching both of you sides Orientalism in some detail. And what this video lecture, based on an earlier PPT which I have shared with both of you, will attempt to do is to give you a detailed outline of Said's main arguments in Orientalism and also discuss some critical responses to the same. Please forgive the occasional slurping noise. That's me drinking some coffee, one of the benefits of working from home. So that's what we're going to do in this lecture. It's going to be a bit of a long lecture, but it is a very important one. As I've said, this is a central text in post-colonial studies, a foundational text really, and it's important both for my PG 1 second semester batch and for my PhD batch. So I'm going to use this for both of you. I will put it up on YouTube and you may both watch it ahead of your examinations. Okay, so now I have already started this topic with both of you. I hope both your batches have the rather extravagant PPT that I'd made, which begins with a picture from Sandman and some suitably exotic music from Arabia. And I went through some pictures, some paintings, and I tried to show you some how these paintings might represent an attitude that Said calls Orientalist. And I did this for a reason. Remember that I often give questions that are application based. This means that once you have understood the concept, you will be asked to read a text, an unseen passage perhaps, or a painting, and then you'll be asked to explain what about this text or painting, in what way does it demonstrate the concept. All right, so in the case of Orientalism, once you've understood what Orientalism is about, you should be able to look at an unseen passage written by a Western author about the East and outline what is problematic about it, outline just in exactly what ways it is Orientalist. All right, so please mentally prepare yourself for that. That said, this lecture is very, very important. I want you to take thorough notes. You should be able to answer long questions on both the main arguments of Orientalism as well as the principal problems that have been outlined by critics about it. Okay, let's move on. Now, this part I have already done to some extent. I'm just going to run through this very, very quickly with you. The intellectual background to Orientalism. As you know, Said's ideas are based on certain notions of Michel Foucault. Of course, it has been suggested that he doesn't apply them rigorously, and we'll get to that somewhat later. But nonetheless, not only for the purposes of understanding Said, but for understanding numerous other scholars, for understanding post-colonial studies itself, we really have to understand these concepts of discourse, power knowledge, and the genealogical method. Now, I've already done this with both your classes to some extent, so maybe you don't have to take notes in this section. You already have notes. I've also given you a scanned copy of my introduction to Orientalism. Please, both of your batches, remember that that introduction is very much in your syllabus. It's 27 pages. I have handwritten notes on it. I have also read through it with my PG batch to some extent. In the first 2 pages of that, I have given you some handwritten notes on what discourse is, what power knowledge is, what genealogical method is. And I'm going to use those in this lecture as well to discuss them. So let's begin with the idea of a discourse. Now, one of the most widely used terms in Western humanities, often misused. Best to understand it very clearly and rigorously. A discourse is a set of ideas and practices with particular conditions of existence which are more or less institutionalized. All right, this is a definition by Stephen Gill. Understand it clearly. A discourse is a set of ideas and practices. You can think of it as a set of conversations, but a set of conversations under certain limiting as well as enabling conditions of existence. All right, there are certain factors, certain limits placed on what can be said and what can be known, and these limits are more or less institutionalized. That is to say, it is institutions that produce the conditions for valid knowledge. All right, so we look at this in a little bit more detail. Again, here I'm following the handwritten notes that I have in my scanned copy of Orientalism, but a discourse, let's understand this very clearly. And I'll read you a particular definition and then I'll go over it point by point, because you need to understand this very clearly. A discourse is a historically contingent social system that produces knowledge and meaning. A discourse is distinctly material in effect, producing practices that systematically form the objects of which they speak. Discourses are produced by effects of power within a social order, and this power prescribes particular rules and categories which define the criteria for legitimizing knowledge and truth within the discursive order. Okay, that's a long winding definition, but do not panic, I will explain it. It's not that complicated. It's, in a nutshell, it's a set of conversations produced and enabled by certain institutions of power, operating within certain constraints, within certain rules as to what constitutes valid knowledge. All right, again, let me go over this definition clearly. A historically contingent social system, this means that it is dependent on particular material historical conditions. A discourse is something that was produced at a particular juncture in history, is dependent on material forces, on power relations, on particular historical conditions. Okay, but this is part of why Said's understanding of Orientalism is problematic, because he suggests it's a timeless Western attitude towards the East, which runs aground, which runs against Foucault's notion of a discourse, because Foucault thinks of it as extremely historically contingent, dependent on very particular material conditions. All right, in fact, Said's understanding of Orientalism is mainly based on 19th century British and French attitudes towards the East, and he backward projects this into all of Western thinking about the East, and that's the problem. All right, so anyway, a discourse as a historically contingent social system that produces knowledge and meaning. All right, it produces certain objects of study, it produces certain kinds of meaning. A discourse is distinctly material in effect. This means it has real world effects. All right, it cements power, it reifies power, it has distinct material effects, it creates objects of knowledge, and these are concretized in certain material practices. All right, so discourse is distinctly material in effect, producing practices that systematically form the objects of which they speak. So let me give you an example. One would be the discipline of psychiatry, that, as we know it, sort of arises in the 19th century, becomes more evolved and complex in the 20th century. But you see, psychiatry is one of these practices that systematically form the objects of which they speak, because psychiatry produces, for instance, categories such as a bipolar person, categories such as a psychopath, categories such as a depressive person. All right, and all of these are there in that the great sort of dictionary of psychiatry, DSM, I forget exactly what it's called. But the essence of the point I'm trying to make is that disciplines produce certain objects of which they speak. All right, now you might well say that a bipolar person exists independent of psychiatry, but not really, you see, because there is a kind of undifferentiated spectrum of human behaviors. But what creating the category of bipolar does is it reifies this, okay? It becomes something concrete, it becomes a definition, and it becomes a sort of something that is used to measure a real human being in all their complexity against. All right, so it collapses the variability, the complexity of an individual into a kind of reified category of bipolar. All right, so that's the issue here, that disciplines, discourses which are produced by disciplines uh, systematically form certain objects of which they speak. All right, discourses are produced by effects of power within a social order. So discourses are produced by effects of power means certain technologies, certain institutions produce discourses. So for instance, the Asiatic society in the 18th century and the 19th century was a British institution that produced certain kinds of knowledge, certain discourses about the Orient. Similarly, in the humanities, the MLA, Modern Languages Association, is an institution. Okay, it has certain effects of power. It produces certain kinds of discourse. Similarly, the APA, the American Psychological Association. All right, or you may broaden this out to think of other kinds of institutions such as prisons, even schools and universities, which are sometimes a lot like prisons, will have, so these are institutions which produce certain kinds of discourses. All right, so discourses are produced by effects of power within a social order, and this power prescribes particular rules and categories which define the criteria for legitimizing knowledge and truth within this discursive order. Again, what this means is that within a discourse there will be a set of rules, a set of practices by which there is a definition of the criteria for legitimate knowledge. So the best example here is, as I've said, of science. Science as we now know it is a discourse which has particular rules and categories which define what valid knowledge is, what legitimate knowledge is. That is, within scientific thought, you have to refer to the evidence, you have to refer to the method of experimentation, observation, inference. The experiment has to be repeatable. All right, it has to have that 5 sigma level of certainty. And so these are the particular rules which form valid, legitimate knowledge within this discourse. Any knowledge that you produce which does not meet these criteria is not legitimate scientific knowledge. All right, which is why scientists laugh at, for instance, cryptozoologists. All right, people who study things like, or claim to study, quote unquote study, things like Loch Ness monster or the abominable snowman. The problem is that although there is some reference to some anecdote, someone saw the Loch Ness monster, some shady photograph of it, it is simply not rigorous enough. There is not enough of a reference to evidence, to experimentation, observation, inference. It is not repeatable, and therefore this knowledge is pseudo-scientific knowledge. All right, the rules and categories which define the criteria for legitimate knowledge within science are too stringent for these persons who are doing so-called research. All right, this research does not meet the criteria for valid scientific knowledge. All right, so that's how a discourse works. You can think of other discourses, of course, with their own criteria for valid knowledge. As I've told both your classes before, mysticism, for instance, is one type of discourse. Within mysticism, you will need to have some kind of experience of the divine. You can't go into a conference of mystics and say, I've read a book about God and thus I know God. That is simply not valid criteria for knowledge formation within this discourse. All right, so different discourses have different rules, different criteria for what valid knowledge is. Just like in a conference of scientists, you can't say that I had a daydream about flying horses and therefore all horses fly. They laugh at you, because for them valid knowledge is based upon certain things. Similarly, in a conference of mystics, you can't go and say, I have a mathematical proof for the existence of God. There has to be certain experiential quality to your understanding of God. Okay, that is what mysticism is about. So when Said says that Orientalism is a discourse, this is what he means, that it is a set of conversations really, which is produced by power and which prescribes particular rules and categories which define legitimate knowledge. So you can't just say anything within Orientalist discourse. It has to meet certain criteria. So for instance, I've talked about textualist bias as one of the most important features of this discourse. As I've said, you could not say just anything about the Orient. It had to some extent, corroborate, tally with what earlier experts and authorities have said, that textualist bias being one of the criteria for valid knowledge formation within this discourse. All right. So that's a little bit about discourse. Now, let's move on. So I've already done this with your class. I'm just going to read through this. I've explained this already. According to Foucault, discourse is defined by any type of activity of communication and representation, verbal or otherwise, that is conditioned and constrained by a set of explicit and implicit rules that enable any activity and at the same time limit it. You know, you can think of it almost as a kind of puppet theater. All right, if you want to remember this and remember it for all time, because you know that's how you should understand things. You should, 10 years down the line, you should be able to tell your children, what discourse is. And just think about it like this: it's a puppet dangling from certain strings. The strings enable certain kinds of movement, but the strings are also a limitation. It can't move in just any way. So a discourse is a kind of communication or representation that is conditioned and constrained by a set of explicit and implicit rules that enable activity and at the same time limit it. Alright, I've mentioned Kuhn's notion of paradigm shift. Again, it's a bit of a detour, so I'm not going there now. So, for instance, I've already explained this. The discourse of science is underpinned by Enlightenment rationality, inductive reasoning, basic structure of experimentation, observation, inference. This structure enables certain kind of knowledge to be formed and at the same time sets limits on what can be known. So what does this mean? Enable certain kind of knowledge. So this framework of experimentation, observation and inference, it can be applied anywhere. You can take it to Mars and you can form knowledge about Mars. So this is a structure that enables a certain kind of knowledge to be formed. But at the same time, it's a limiting set. Okay, you can't talk in certain ways within this discourse. You can't talk about spirituality or mysticism. And who's to say those are not valid forms of knowing? Alright, there are different experiences, there are different forms of knowing, but science does not recognize all of them. Alright, so science is a structure that enables certain kind of knowledge to be formed, but also sets limits on what can be known. That was my coffee, sorry. So yeah, the system of discourse structures the manner in which we perceive reality. It determines what constitutes right or wrong, defines the range of possible utterances in speech and representation, underlies any capacity to understand or argue, allocates the right to speak, and in fact governs over everything that can and cannot be said or known. Sorry, there should be an N there. But again, let me go through this point by point. Discourse structures the manner in which we perceive reality. So it is a set of ideas through which we see the world. It's a kind of lens. So we never really see reality unmediated. Whether it's through language or through science, we have various discourses which structure the way in which we perceive reality. Alright? It determines what constitutes right or wrong. So again, I've said that within discourse, certain things will be legitimized, certain things will be delegitimized. So a discourse is a kind of constraint on what is right or wrong. It defines the range of possible utterances in speech and representation. So it gives you a limit. It defines the range of what you can say and what you can represent and what you can't. Alright, there are certain things that will not constitute valid knowledge, valid speech, valid representation within a discourse. The discourse gives you a range of what you can speak about. Again, it underlies any capacity to understand or argue. So, for instance, within a scientific debate, it is the language of mathematics, the language of science that underlies, that forms the premise for any capacity to understand or argue. So, any debate that you'd have, supposing you're in a conference of scientists and you're having a debate, you would have to refer to that underlying discourse. You have to refer to that set of rules, all right? Um, your debate, your understanding, and your argument are conditioned by um, conditioned or premised upon the rules of that particular discourse. Okay, allocates the right to speak. So, certain people who have that particular type of knowledge, who are conversant in a particular discourse, are the ones who are allocated the right to speak. So, within scientific discourse, it is a person who's trained in science, who can speak and who can produce legitimate knowledge about the world. All right, so scientists would not consider Baba Ramdev to be someone who has the right to speak in a scientific manner. All right, it is someone who possesses the required knowledge of the discourse. All right, and this similarly happens in Orientalism as well. It is the Orientalist who has read widely about the Orient who is allocated the right to speak. And this becomes a big problem because just about anyone cannot say anything about the Orient. It is always the Orientalist, the professional scholar of the Orient, who hegemonizes knowledge production within Orientalism. All right. Anyway, so allocates the right to speak and in fact governs over everything that can and cannot be said or known. So again, I've explained this already. You cannot just say anything or know anything. The discourse delimits what can be said, what can be known. All right. So that is your discourse. Moving on, let's look at power knowledge, and I'll just rush through this because this is going to be a very long lecture. Look, the basic point is that power and knowledge implicate each other. Power requires knowledge to function. Knowledge in turn stabilizes or sort of calcifies power. Okay, power knowledge. The basic point is that power produces bodies of knowledge, and bodies of knowledge produce power. One leads to the other. So for for Foucault, power and knowledge are not seen as independent entities, but are inextricably related. Knowledge is always an exercise of power, and power always a function of knowledge. Now, let's break this down. Think about it very simply. Knowledge is always an exercise of power. This means that to know something, or to know someone even, is to have a certain power over them. Okay, think about this in absolutely layman's terms. Just try and understand it. If you know a secret about your best friend, do you or do you not in some sense have a certain power over them? Yes, you do. All right, knowledge gives you power over things, over people. All right, if you were to know about Mars, you would have to send rovers to Mars, you would have to send satellites to Mars, you would have to, in other words, produce an exercise of power. So knowledge involves an exercise of power. Knowledge also grants power. Okay, knowledge is always an exercise of power. To know is to control, and power always a function of knowledge. So power is dependent on, okay, so P is F of K. So power is conditioned by, is dependent on, is a function of knowledge. Okay, let's look at this little, I don't know if you can see this mouse pointer. You should be able to see it, but I'm moving my mouse over this little diagram to the right. So power will establish institutions such as schools, hospitals, prisons. Okay, these institutions will provoke what Foucault calls incitement to discourse, will incite or provoke certain forms of knowledge. So when you set up a school, it will incite, it will involve the production of certain kinds of knowledge. Similarly, hospitals, similarly prisons. In hospitals, it will be knowledge about the patient. In prisons, it will be disciplinary knowledge about the location, whereabouts, activities of the prisoners. So Power establishes institutions. These institutions provoke or produce forms of knowledge that could be educating or caring for or punishing. But essentially, all of these activities, uh, all of this knowledge formation constitutes certain kinds of subjects. So think about psychiatry and the bipolar person. Think about the discourse around homosexuality in the 19th century and the formation of the idea of the homosexual. All right, so that discourse about deviant sexuality in the 19th century constitutes, okay, it produces, the institution produces certain kinds of knowledge and constitutes the homosexual as a subject of that knowledge. All right, and this knowledge thus produced then goes on to actualize, modify, redistribute, stabilize. So it feeds into power. So power provokes, establishing power creates institutions. Institutions create or necessitate the formation of knowledge. These bodies of knowledge constitute subjects in various ways, discipline subjects in various ways, and thereby restabilizes, reifies, calcifies, or in some way feeds back into power. Alright, so it's a kind of loop. Perhaps Foucault's most famous example of a practice of power knowledge is that of the confession. I've already discussed this as outlined in A History of Sexuality. Once solely a practice of the Christian Church, Foucault argues that it became diffused into secular culture, especially psychology, in the 18th and 19th centuries. Through the confession, a form of knowledge, people were incited to tell the truth, that is, produce knowledge about their sexual desires, emotions, and dispositions. Through these confessions, the idea of a sexual identity at the core of the self came into existence, a form of knowledge, an identity that had to be monitored, cultivated, and often controlled. Again, back to power. So, basically, power here, the Catholic Church, alright, the institution is the Catholic Church. It produces confession, which is a form of power, which provokes knowledge formation. The knowledge formation is people talking about their innermost deviant desires, sexual urges, emotions, okay? And through these confessions, what happens is that there is this idea of a sexual identity at the core of the self which comes into existence. And this sexual identity, of course, needs to be policed, or, that's what the discourse suggests. Okay, so this incitement to discourse produces the subject who is someone having uncontrollable desires or secret desires, and this type of subject begs for or calls for power to monitor, control it. All right, so this subject so constituted reifies or stabilizes the power of the Christian Church. Simple enough. All right. It is important to note that Foucault understood power knowledge as productive as well as constraining. Power knowledge not only limits what we can do, but also opens up new ways of acting and thinking about ourselves. So this is easy enough to understand. Power knowledge will produce certain kinds of subjects, but again, it also constrains. It's you can't just say anything. So it's sort of the idea of the discourse. All right, you can produce certain kinds of knowledge, but you also constrain. Power knowledge is not only something that constrains, but also something that opens up new ways of acting and thinking about us. Moving on. Okay, the genealogical method. I have a little meme here of William Jones. This is quite simple to understand. Essentially, a genealogical inquiry seeks to expose how supposedly basic categories such as the Orient or sex are produced by discursive practices. Okay, so a genealogical method, you could also call it discourse analysis, basically, where it's a term for the Foucauldian-Saidian method of looking at how supposedly basic categories are in fact products of discourse. Such a critique does not try to tell us what, for instance, the Orient or sex really are, but seeks to show how the notion has been created. So you'll remember, at least in my PG class, I'm not sure if I did this with the PhD class, but it's the difference between asking about what sexual practices were like in the 18th century, and I drew a cartoon of a speech bubble, of a person's speech bubble and sexuality within quotes. That is the genealogical method. It's not interested in the historical truth so much as the ways in which a certain thing is talked about. Why did people talk about sexuality in a particular way? How did relationships of power lead to a particular construction of sexuality? How did this construction of sexuality in turn have real effects on the world? How did it alter power relations? All right, so discourse analysis or genealogical method is always at one step away from the veridic content of a discourse. It's looking at conversations, really, the reasons why people talk in certain ways and the effects that this has. All right, so Said's method, like Foucault's in most of his works, is genealogical. A genealogical inquiry seeks to expose how supposedly basic categories such as the Orient and sex are produced by discursive practices. So I've given you a little diagram there of how discourse produces the notion of sex. That's not to say that there isn't real sex. People are having real sex, but there is, over and above that material reality, there is the discursive reality. There's a set of conversations about sex and sexuality, all right? So such a critique does not try to tell us what sex or the Orient really is, but seeks to show us how the notion has been created, also why the notion has been created, how the speaker benefits from framing the Orient or sex in a particular way, and such, all right? Power relations. So this does not amount to a denial that sex or the Orient are not real as well. It just means that they have a discursive reality over and above the material reality, and importantly interacts with and sometimes determines the material reality. So these are not just conversations floating in the air, all right? These are conversations with real material effects. If you talk about homosexuals in a particular way, if you frame them as aberrant, then you can have something in the penal code, section 377, which the British made, which has real effects, which criminalizes homosexual activity. Thankfully, it's now been removed, but that is what I'm saying. A discourse is not something that's floating in the air. A discourse, a concept discursively created, has a conversational reality over and above the material reality, but it also interacts with, determines, affects the material reality. All right. Now, it would be wrong to conclude that the Orient was essentially an idea or a creation with no corresponding reality. So similarly, when it comes to the Orient, there is a discursive reality, but there is also a corresponding geopolitical reality. There were and are cultures and nations whose location is in the East, and their lives, histories, and customs have a brute reality obviously greater than anything that could be said about them in the West. So one thing that Said is quite open about in his introduction to Orientalism is that he is not denying that there is a real place that the term Orient denotes, and that it has real histories and real customs, but he isn't so interested in these. He is more interested in what people have said about them. Okay, so let's move on. Now, I've skipped the biography of Said. It's not that important. I'm just going to go through this again. I may have done some of this with my PG class. I apologize, but it might be useful for you to have this lecture in a recorded form so that you can go over it over and over again. Slow it down, take notes, do whatever you need to. Okay, so what is Orientalism in a nutshell? Few living intellectuals can claim to have written a text that has revolutionized several fields in both social sciences and humanities, and fewer are responsible for the genesis of a whole field of inquiry. Said asserts in Orientalism that the Orient is a creation of the West. That is, the quote-unquote Orient was created as an object of scholarly knowledge in the West that necessarily coincided with the rise of the age of Western imperialism. As an object as opposed to subject of knowledge, the Orient is configured as passive, reified, unchanging, and stagnant. Orientalism facilitates a relationship of power between the Occident and Orient that is unequal and based on the domination of the latter by the former. So basically, a set of stereotypes about the East as being passive, unchanging, stagnant, deviant. All right. So a set of stereotypes which justifies an unequal relation of power, domination of the West over the East. Again, to bring this down to kind of class 1 level, okay, something you can always remember, think about it this way. If you have to have power over some classmate of yours, if you want to dominate over them, one very simple thing you could say is, gossip about them and say terrible things. Say this person is bad, 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 has done this, done that, done that. And what this set of conversations will do is it will facilitate a relationship of unequal power between you and your classmate. Alright, so if you want to have power over someone, say bad things about them. Alright, don't tell people that I teach you these things, but this is how things work. Alright, so that is the basic argument that Said tries to make. Orientalism, however, Said states, is not merely an airy European fantasy about the Orient, but a created body of theory and practice in which, for many generations, there has been a considerable material investment. So, as I said, a discourse is not merely a kind of airy fantasy set of words floating in the air, but it has, a concomitant material investment. All right. So, this brilliant study, avoid eulogizing in your own answers. I've taken this from John C. Hawley's Postcolonial Studies Encyclopedia. But anyway, this brilliant study, that is Orientalism, shows us that the representation of the Orient was created and codified to facilitate in the mind and policies of the Western imperialist apparatus control of conquered peoples and territories. Through representation that could be containment, Said says. The fact that the discourse of Orientalism is elastic, and that as the production of knowledge regarding the Orient, it finds its reproduction in voluntary and non-coercive institutions, ensured its longevity and ability to change as the needs for colonial and imperialist control change. So here Hawley is pointing to the elasticity of Orientalism. It's a body of ideas that grows to some extent, and it is reproduced not only in coercive institutions but also in seemingly non-coercive institutions such as higher education and journalism. And this diffuse nature of the discourse ensures its longevity and ability to mildly change. Said will say that manifest features may mildly change as the needs for colonial and imperialist control change. So we have now moved from the period of colonialism into what we call imperialism or neo-colonialism, where we have decolonized the world. We have most former colonies have freed themselves from European direct colonialism, but nonetheless there is still economic inequality. The Western powers, the superpowers, still dominates over the East mostly. All right, and what happens is that this whole set of ideas of Orientalism, it doesn't die with the death of colonialism. It simply changes a little bit and adapts itself to the age of imperialism or neocolonialism. And which is why I encourage you to read the preface, Said's preface. He writes several prefaces. The most up-to-date edition will have the most recent preface. But in his preface, he will talk about American imperialism in the Middle East. He's going to talk about oil and American Orientalism. So that kind of contextualizes things, makes it more up to date. So I encourage you to read these prefaces. Now I am going to attempt to pause the video here for a second, pause the recording rather. I'm going to make myself some coffee. Let's hope this doesn't crash. So here goes. Hello, I'm back. I'm back with my coffee. That should have been just a couple of seconds for you, but it was several minutes for me. And I'm going to take a little detour here, because just as I was coming back from the kitchen to my room, I started to hear from the bosti next door, from the slum next door, banging of pots and pans. Dishing, 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 dishing. And you all know what's going on with these pots and pans, this Prime Minister of ours issued this order or whatever directive saying that at 5 p.m. on the day of the Janata curfew, everyone has to come out and clap. And I understand that, okay, there is some, perhaps at its root, there is some desire to appreciate the efforts of health workers and other people who have had to stay out. But it's more than that. It's much more than that. It's a politicizing. It's a kind of it's taking advantage of a health crisis to essentially homogenize and collectivize the Indian people into a kind of unthinking mass, one that is supportive, one that is emotionally swayed easily, and one that expresses itself in these frenetic displays of of emotion. It has a kind of religious cultic fervor and energy to it, which really kind of troubles and disturbs me. And I mention this not out of context, but you know I'm going to here sort of really stray into problematic territory, because what I'm going to suggest is that there are times when things that Orientalists have said about India, particularly, they sometimes seem to have some grain of truth to them. And this entire issue of truth content is not really discussed by Said. One of the problems with Said is that he dismisses everything. He basically says that you Orientalists have stereotyped us, Eastern people, and you've said all these negative things about us. And he says that I'm not actually going to bother to see if there is any truth to these stereotypes, but I'm going to condemn you for having used the stereotypes in the first place. You understand? So there's no investigation of the truth content. So what I find disturbing, and again, you may disagree with me, the government may disagree with me, I'm probably doing something quite unwise putting this on a public forum, but frankly, I don't think it's being anti-national to criticize and to dissent. I think dissent is the highest form of patriotic duty. And I criticize not just the current government, but every government. You must criticize every government, otherwise it will just become a coercive institution. But this thala bati bajano, I fail to understand what are you achieving, bro? I mean, like, what are you getting out of this? It's it's not you should be spending your time doing research trying to cure the disease, but instead, and people are congregating in big numbers. When this thalabati bhajano began in my neighborhood, people are meeting in 10s, 15s, 20s, so a virus is going to spread. Anyway, the bigger point is that what I think this particular thalabati cult represents is at least three tendencies that I find, and I'm making sweeping statements, and that is problematic, and that is part of what Said is criticizing. But think through this and tell me if you agree or don't agree. But number one, a deep-rooted tendency in Indians to towards personality cults. You see, why is Modi? So it's not about BJP. We Indians worship Modi. It's this idea of Modi, larger than life, a godlike image, and this is broader than just Modi. It's a deep feature of our civilization. If you look at the way Bollywood heroes are revered in our country, yes, fandom is a universal phenomenon, but there is a level to which it's taken in India, particularly with the likes of Shah Rukh Khan, Salman Khan, where it is, we do have this tendency to be drawn towards personality cults. And I think this has to do with the tradition of the guru in Indian civilization, in Hindu civilization particularly. This idea of the wise man, all right, who you worship, who you is completely surrender to, someone who you revere like a god, all right, and it's there in our culture. So number one, tendency to be drawn towards personality cults. Number two, tendency to collectivize, to act as a collective, to think in collectives. I'm not saying that there aren't individuals, but it seems that we as a civilization are very capable of acting in collectives, thinking in collectives. And this you see, for instance, when you're talking about the rise of the novel in India. we are talking about the novel as an embodiment of certain collective ideals, whereas the novel in the West is the embodiment of the individual bourgeois consciousness, as Ian Watt puts it in his Rise of the Novel. The rise of prose fiction in India is implicated in the formation of certain collective values, the idea of the nation, imagining the nation out of nothing, as it were. But it's this tendency towards collectives, and you see it everywhere. You see it from Kumbh Mela to pilgrimages to we're talking about this tendency of Indians to think in collectives, act in collectives. I was going in a train once, and through central India, and it was the time of the elections, and there was this one Bengali fellow who got into an argument with a whole lot of North Indian men, and eventually it became a shouting contest. They weren't even listening to the points that he was making. The whole train, and this is what frightened me, whole train became one mass of shouting, Jai Shri Ram, Jai Shri Ram, Jai Shri Ram. And the poor bong guy, he was just shivering, he's literally pooping his pants, because there's a whole train full of people, collectively shouting and chanting like this. So, tendency towards collectives. And thirdly, and again, I understand these are perhaps problematic, even Orientalist statements, but do you not see this in our daily lives to some extent? Do you not trust, honestly, do you not? Again, the third point I was going to say is that this Thalabati business, it shows us this, tendency towards frenetic emotive displays, all right, a kind of religious frenzy almost. And I think this has its roots in the fact that we have been in for many centuries a deeply religious country. There is no denying this. We have not been, historically speaking, secular. The current Indian state, the model of the state, is based on partly a Western ideal of secularism, which does not sit well, which does not square with our deep roots. This separation of church and state is not something that is deeply, Indian. We have not had a reformation. So the point is that, we have been a deeply religious. Look at our history. Look at the Vellore Mutiny, 1806. Where did resistance to British rule start? Why did it start? It began because the East India Company started to interfere with caste marks, with religious issues. The 1857 revolt, it began because of what? Greased cartridges, all right? Oil from pigs and cows, which offended both Hindus and Muslims. So, we have been, and this is a generalization, and I encourage you to criticize it, but we have been a religious people. So you see, these three things that I very, very heuristically and with a great deal of reservation I am foisting right now, this tendency towards narrative cults, towards collective thought and action, towards frenetic, religious or sort of, quasi-religious displays of emotional intensity. All of these are features, I feel, of Indian civilization. Now, if an Orientalist, if a Western scholar says these things, he will be dismissed as being an Orientalist, and it will be called a racist attitude, etc., etc. But this is the problem, one of the many problems with Said's thesis. He is outlining how the West has thought in certain stereotypes, but he is not bothering to see whether this process of stereotyping is actually based on real and verifiable observations of Indian culture. In other words, he will call William Jones an Orientalist, essentially in a kind of slur, almost as if racist, without seeing if what William Jones is saying about India is in fact true or not. Alright, so this was a long detour, and I apologize for those of you who want a short and brief lecture, but I need you to think. I need you to think. That's the point of education, is not to mug things up, but to think. Okay, so let's move on now. Okay, now to illustrate, and again I've gone further than this with my PG class, but again it helps to revise. I am going to show you a little extract from a novel called The Missionary and Indian Tale, by Sidney Owenson, who was a 19th century Irish novelist. There's a passage in this novel which I think perfectly demonstrates the essentializing attitude that Orientalism involves, the tendency to think of the East and West as binary opposites. All right, a perfect example. However, the novel itself will complicate this thesis as the novel progresses. But let's just read this extract. We are dealing with two characters here: Hilarion, who is an Italian missionary who's come to India with the hope of converting all Indians to Christianity. And we have Laksima, who is this Indian Hindu priestess, quote unquote priestess. Of course, Owenson is writing without the awareness that there aren't, in fact, priestesses in Hinduism, at least there weren't traditionally, it was all men. But anyway, the premise is that Hilarion meets this woman, Laksima, and she is coming together of various Oriental stereotypes. She's, feminine and beautiful and radiant, and she has glowing hair, and she's dressed in these kind of flimsy see-through clothes, and basically he's sexually fixated with this person, and that frustrates his mission, that problematizes his quest to proselytize Indians. So let's just read this. This being of spiritual mystery, Laksima, seemed then given up to a silent and religious rapture. And the missionary Hilarion, by a slight movement, changing his position, beheld the rapt countenance of the votarist, who had so sublimely assimilated herself to the orb she worshipped and the god she served. It was Laksima. At the rustling of his robe among the trees, she started, turned around, and her eyes fell upon his figure, while her own was still fixed in the graceful attitude of devotion. Silently gazing in wonder upon each other, they stood finely opposed, the noblest specimens of the human species as it appears in the most opposite regions of the earth. She, like the East, lovely and luxuriant; he, like the West, lofty and commanding. The one radiant in all the luster, attractive in all the softness which distinguishes her native regions; the other towering in all the energy, imposing in all the vigor which marks his ruder latitudes. She, looking like a creature formed to feel and to submit; he, like a being created to resist and to command. While both appeared as the ministers and representatives of the two most powerful religions of the earth, the one no less enthusiastic in her brilliant errors than the other confident in his immutable truth. So you can see here exactly what Said is saying, basically that East is stereotyped as luxuriant, exotic, but essentially religious, which I myself was suggesting 10 minutes ago problematically, but the East as religious, mystical, luxuriant, but also, created to submit, whereas the West is lofty, commanding, intellectually rigorous, powerful, being created to resist and to command. Okay, so this is a kind of Orientalist attitude that you see displayed in this passage. But what's interesting about this novel is that it will go on to deconstruct this mythic statement of Orientalism. This is a very, very interesting novel to read vis-a-vis Said, The Missionary and Indian Tale by Sidney Owenson, because, you see, for one thing, Owenson is herself an Orientalist in the sense that she's a scholar of the East, but she is an armchair traveler. She reads vast amounts of literature being written by other professional Orientalists, and she forms all her ideas about India, many of them incorrect ideas. For instance, the idea that we have female priests. She forms all her ideas based on these books. But what she does as the novel progresses is she deconstructs this mythic statement of Orientalism, that the East is feminine and powerless and the West is masculine and powerful. What actually happens in the novel is that as the novel progresses, Laksima grows more and more powerful. Hilarion has a kind of psychological breakdown, his mission fails, and eventually they're both kind of destroyed. Laksima dies, Hilarion goes mad, he lives the rest of his life in a cave. But the point is that it deconstructs this mythic statement of Orientalism, all right? And many authors have suggested this is a kind of feminist novel. It's really saying that, women can be powerful. Women uh, suffer under Oriental women suffer under these Orientalist stereotypes that they are weak and feminine, but they can in fact be powerful and magnetic and potentially even destructive forces. So it's a very interesting and complicated novel, but nonetheless, this particular passage, taken out of context, certainly is perhaps the paradigmatic example of a kind of Orientalist mindset. Okay, moving on. According to Said, the Orientalist, the heir to a narcissistic tradition of European writing, founded by, amongst others, Homer and Aeschylus, through his writing, creates the Orient. In the process, he assists in the creation of a series of stereotypical images according to which Europe, the West, the Self, is seen as being essentially rational, developed, humane, superior, authentic, active, creative, and masculine, while the Orient, the East, the other, a sort of surrogate underground version of the West or the Self, is seen as being irrational, aberrant, backward, crude, despotic, inferior, inauthentic, passive, feminine, and sexually corrupt. Together, they contribute to the construction of a saturating hegemonic system designed consciously or unconsciously to dominate, restructure, and have authority over the Orient, designed, that is to say, to promote European imperialism and colonialism. Said focused on the predominance of images, ideas, and beliefs in the writings of all Western authors, which went towards perpetuating an ontological, that means to do with being, an epistemological, that means to do with knowledge, distinction between the Orient and the Occident, which could be strategically manipulated to retain the hegemonic superiority of the West over the East, especially in the context of colonial power relations. So it's all here. It's very simple, a set of stereotypical images about the East, which serves to consciously or unconsciously perpetuate an asymmetrical relation of power between West and East. Moving on, what is the Orient in Orientalism? Put simply, it is the East, both an idea and a real geographical territory. So as I've said, there is a discursive reality to the Orient, but there is also a geographical and political reality. So it is the East, both an idea and a real geographical territory as conceived of by the West, Europe and America. Geographically, it is roughly coextensive and coterminous with Asia. Conceptually, it has certain distinct features too. Here I'm quoting from my own PhD thesis, forgive me, but I have discussed this in some detail there, so it's just convenient for me. We are on slightly firmer ground when discussing the Orient, which I sometimes use synonymously with the East, as the authors I study themselves do. I do not want to suggest that there is an ontological essence that binds the whole of Asia together. However, there is a discursive cohesion as well as a corresponding geographical referent to the term. So what I mean here is that, firstly, there is a discursive cohesion. The term Orient refers to Asia and all the stereotypical ideas about Asia. This has a kind of discursive cohesion. It also has a geographical referent. It basically means Asia, all right, the area on the map denoted by Asia. That's not to say that I believe there is some kind of essence that binds all of Asia together, but perhaps the Orientalist authors themselves in the 18th and 19th centuries did to some extent. So it's a real place, but also a discursive place or a set of ideas. So Said is helpful in pointing out that the term Orient has a fairly clear history and tradition of thought. Imagery and vocabulary have given it reality and presence in and for the West. I heuristically agree to its presence as an object of discourse, mostly because it crops up repeatedly in the text I examine. This is again from my thesis. Further, Said clarifies that he does not want to suggest that the Orient was essentially an idea or a creation with no corresponding reality. There was a real Orient corresponding to the concept. As Alexander McPhee suggests, it denoted Turkey, Syria, Palestine, Mesopotamia and Arabia, later also India, China and Japan, and even the whole of Asia. Alright, so that is what the Orient is. Both a discursive place and a real place. Now, we're getting to the sort of meat of the whole issue, the kind of central part of this lecture and discussion, which is basically what are Said's what does Said delineate as the main features of Orientalist discourse, or the kind of principal dogmas of Orientalism. So, number one, he suggests that Orientalism involves a negation of the Orient through a set of stereotypes, okay, a framing of the Orient as essentially other. So absolute and systematic difference between the West, which is rational, developed, humane, superior, and the Orient, which is aberrant, undeveloped, inferior. This set of stereotypes gives the East an ontological stability and sets it apart as essentially the opposite of Europe. What are some of these stereotypes? 1. Stuck in the past or backward. No conception of history, so no systematic history writing. West needs to write history for them, alright? So this is something that you see in a lot of 18th century authors. They will reiterate that there is no systematic history written by Indians about India. We will write your history, which gives them a kind of opening to control us through discourse, to produce certain ideas perpetuated in history textbooks about us. Passive as opposed to active West. So corollary is feminine and in need of rescue. So the East as passive, the East as feminine, the West as masculine, the West as active. The kind of implicit corollary is that the East is also in need of rescue. Now this crops up in many ways in different kinds of stories about India particularly. I know the case of India slightly better because my PhD thesis was on representations of India in Western discourse. One trope that recurs in fiction of the 18th and 19th centuries about India written by the British is the trope of sati, in which you will have a woman who is about to be burnt on the funeral pyre of her husband. Husband is portrayed as tyrannical, treacherous, and the British man in the novel will come and rescue this Indian woman, and the Indian woman becomes a kind of synecdoche for the country as a whole, the novel thereby justifying a kind of benevolent British rule in India. All of this is of course complex. You have to realize that the British did play a role in eradicating sati as a historical reality. Yes, of course, Raja Ram Mohan Roy and other reformers were hand in hand with them, but William Bentinck did do his part to eradicate sati. We can't take away entirely from some of the things that some of what the British have done to our culture. In some ways, not all of it needs to be terrible. All right. Anyway, lazy, promiscuous, lustful. This again becomes a premise for exploring Western fantasies. A lot of the kind of pulp fiction being produced in the 18th and 19th centuries about India particularly would be of a kind of pornographic nature, in which Indian women would be sorry, that was my mom. So promiscuous, lustful. So a lot of the popular literature of the 19th century, 18th century would frame Indian women as promiscuous and lustful, and this becomes a kind of premise for exploring sexuality. So you would have British authors basically writing about India and going wild in their exploring their kinks and their sexual sort of fetishes. And because it's set in India, because the Indian woman is shown as being the lustful one, all of this is kind of excused and justified, all right? Moving on, sexually deviant, rulers despotic. Now, this is a very important stereotype, the notion of Oriental despotism. This is one of these stereotypes that is very concrete. It's a very deeply lodged idea which was backed up by sociological studies, kind of anthropological study, historical study. It feeds into Marx as well. Marx has a whole idea of Asiatic mode of production, and that ties into the idea of Oriental despotism. But anyway, Oriental despotism was the discursively established notion that Oriental rulers were absolute, despotic and oppressive, assuring neither the security of life nor property to their subjects. I've given you some references, I should have italicized there, but basically this becomes again a justification for British rule. You come and say that, hey, your rulers are despotic, oppressive, they don't give you security of life, they don't secure your property. We will come, we will be better rulers, and we will assure that you have benign, benevolent rule, which of course amounted in reality to terrible famines and mass killings and genocides every few decades. But nonetheless, the notion of Oriental despotism is an Orientalist stereotype which does help to justify colonial rule. It's untruthful, mendacious, okay, incapable of being truthful, lacking moral probity. This has many real-world effects as well. When you look at the way in which Hinduism was codified, Hinduism was Hindu texts were translated. There was this pervasive mistrust of Hindu Brahmin scholars. The idea that they are secretive, they don't want to tell you anything about the Vedas, these are secret knowledge, and even if they tell you something, you can't trust what they're saying. These are lies. So that means the British Indologist will have to go and explore these texts himself, translate them himself, interpret them himself. In a sense, what it amounts to is an erasing of Indians from having a voice in the translation of and dissemination of their own religion. All right, you frame these Indian priests and scholars as untruthful, mendacious, immoral, and that means that you will have to write their religion for them. You will have to study it, you will have to translate it, you will have to become the authority rather than them. Number 9, undisciplined. 10, again undisciplined. Corollary is that we will need to come and discipline you, show you how to be orderly subjects. Number 10, mystical rather than rational, particularly Hindus. You see this a lot in, for instance, Baptist discourse early in the 19th century. If you read Carey, Ward, Marshman, the Serampur trio, if you read other missionaries in India, it goes back to Bartholomew Ziegenbalg and other European missionaries who were here before the British. The British didn't allow missionary activity in India until somewhere in the early 19th century. But a lot of what gets said about Hindus, again, I know just about 15 minutes ago I was sort of supporting these hypotheses myself. But that's an interesting thing. Was there a grain of truth in what they were saying? But these missionaries would focus on places like Puri. They would focus on the Rath Yatra and many kinds of displays of frenetical, crazy religiosity. People ostensibly throwing themselves in front of the chariot that's driven, in the Rath Yatra. People apparently in a religious frenzy, chanting and shouting and throwing themselves in front of the wheels of this huge chariot to get crushed to death by God. So Indians as mystical, as fervent, as crazily religious. There are many drawings. If you read 18th century depictions of religion, you'll see there are these, and they get fascinated with it. There's a British fascination towards Indian religiosity. But apparently one form of pilgrimage was to roll on the ground, to go from your home to say Kashi, or to go to Mount Kailash, not walking but rolling along the ground. And there are these drawings, these etchings made in British writings this time, showing these emaciated, crazed looking Indians rolling around on the floor going to meet their gods. Again, sati, the idea that here are these people who are so crazy about the idea of an afterlife, about the kind of karmic benefits of being burnt alive with your husband, that they voluntarily go and throw themselves into the funeral pyre. Now, this particular assertion there is not much historical validity for. If you read Lata Mani's Contentious Traditions or Andrea Major's Pious Flames, which are books on sati, you will see that a lot of first-hand eyewitness accounts, a lot of notes taken from people who did not end up committing sati show that there was a great deal of coercion involved. Sometimes they were drugged, sometimes they were forced, sometimes they were beaten, sometimes they were thrown. But it would take a tremendous degree of indoctrination into the idea that your husband is God, that being burnt alive with him is the right thing to do, for someone to throw themselves onto a burning fire and burn themselves alive. But so anyway, these are things to think about. So here then is the set of 10 stereotypes. So point number one, the main feature of Orientalism, the most marked and obvious tendency of Orientalist discourse, according to Said, is to negate the East through this set of stereotypes. Moving on. Childlike. Oh, sorry, I missed a point. Childlike, yes, again, irrational, childlike, cantankerous, sometimes needful of discipline. Again, feeding into the need to discipline them. On now. All right, so continued. Number two, again, I've mentioned this before, very, very important feature of Orientalist discourse, one that formed one of the criteria for valid knowledge: textualist bias. Now, you'll notice what I've done here is, in each slide, I have a whole lot of text, but I sum it up. The square brackets in the beginning is a kind of nutshell, and that's to help you during revision. When you're revising, you can just sort of write down the bit in the brackets to help you kind of remember, all right? So, textualist bias, reservoir of accredited knowledge. That abstractions about the Orient, particularly those based on texts representing a classical Oriental civilization, are always preferable to direct evidence drawn from modern Oriental realities. This is particularly visible, apparently, according to Said, in French Orientalism. So this is basically an anti-empirical attitude, where what you observe about the Orient is less important than what the authorities have said since time immemorial, all right? The way in which their entire science was derived from books reflected a strange way of thinking. With few exceptions, they had never traveled. Most Orientalists were armchair travelers. The sort of best example being James Mill, whose History of British India becomes one of the most important books about India ever written in the 19th century. But James Mill had not at this point traveled to India. He did not know much about India. It's based on what he read of other people. So with very few exceptions, they had never traveled. They believed everything they read. Surely the Chinese practiced Confucius's beautiful sayings. Theology books and philosophical treatises were considered a precise reflection of life. So the text becomes more important than the meta text, okay, then what underlies the text, or the reality that the text supposedly describes is less important than what the book says. So the best example I can think of here is this book. You can see on the right this drawing. If you've read The Tempest by William Shakespeare, you'll know that this crops up in the Renaissance as well, but this is an etching from the travels of Sir John Mandeville. Asians with their heads growing from their chest. So myth persisted for centuries, which you see this is discussed in The Tempest, although there is some degree of skepticism towards it by the time Shakespeare's writing. But the point is, this man, supposedly certain Sir John Mandeville, the book is a fake, it's a hoax. There was no travel to India. This person just made this stuff up. He talked about rivers and waterfalls where diamonds are falling, and he talked about, apparently in India, people's heads grow out of their chests, and all kinds of complete nonsense. But the point is that this was taken as authoritative, this was believed for several centuries. So there is a kind of anti-empirical attitude in Orientalism, a tendency to refer to a reservoir of accredited knowledge when it comes to deciding what the East is like. Now, this section is a kind of sub point here, and some of you have emailed me because I've already reached this point with my PG1 class, and you said there are some difficulties in understanding this point, so I will try to clarify it in a little bit more detail. In fact, let me just see where my notes are on this particular issue. Okay, I didn't print it out. Anyway, So I'll explain it as best I can. So a kind of sub point here, which I've taken from the section of Orientalism called Latent and Manifest Orientalism, is the inviolable and seemingly neutral nature of this body of textual knowledge, the internal consistency of the discourse. So essentially, one of the things Said says is that this discourse about the East, Orientalism, tends to be very internally inconsistent. That means the ideas are replicated in text over text over text, and it tends to be inviolable. That is, it resists the new knowledge that is being acquired empirically. All right, the textually propagated notions about the East uh, resist the onslaught of new empirical knowledge. All right, and secondly, it presents itself as neutral or sort of scientifically true, or rather than containing any kind of judgment. Okay. So this information seemed to be morally neutral and objectively valid. It seemed to have an epistemological status equal to that of historical chronology or geographical location. So essentially, stories, wild stories about the East, such as John Mandeville, were considered to have a status equal to history, objectively true, or geography, again objectively true. In its most basic form, then, Oriental material could not really be violated by anyone's discoveries, so anti-empirical attitude. Nor did it seem ever to be re-evaluated completely. Okay, it resists change. Surface features may change, so latent and manifest. So Said makes a difference between latent, that is underlying the deep features of Orientalism, and a surface, a kind of manifest Orientalism. And he says that the surface features may seem to shift here and there. Surface features of this knowledge, manifest Orientalism, may change, but not the core. The unanimity, stability, and durability of latent Orientalism are more or less constant. Now, there are a couple of concepts here that I should clarify. This idea of the generally serviceable bin, what Said says, and quite humorously here, is that you have this set of ideas, preconceived ideas about the East. Now, you go to the East, you travel in the East, and you see certain things which do not corroborate, which are not corroborated by this earlier set of ideas, which doesn't fit, which doesn't match your preconceived or textually received notions. So you can see that what these books are saying is not exactly what is the reality, but you frame these deviations from the text as exceptions and sort of chuck them into, throw them into what Said derisively calls a generally serviceable bin. It's as if there's a dustbin that you carry with you when you go to the East. Whatever you see, if it tallies with what you've read in books by Western authors, then it's fine. If it doesn't tally with it, you just frame that as an exception and chuck it into the generally serviceable bin. Alright, this also is related to his concept of flexible positional superiority. This is where Orientalist discourse adjusts itself in order to maintain hegemony, putting the Westerner in a whole series of possible relationships with the Orient without ever losing him the upper hand. As Said explains, the general character ascribed to things Oriental could withstand both the rhetorical and existential force of obvious exception. So this is basically a way of saying that whatever the Westerner sees in Asia, okay, if it upsets preconceived notions, then the discourse adjusts itself. So the manifest features will change. You will say that, okay, supposing I have seen a certain thing happening amongst Hindus that doesn't fit with my preconceived notions about Hindus, what you will say is that, okay, this is an exception. Some Hindus do this, but this doesn't change what we've always known about Hindus, you know. So the general character ascribed to the Orient doesn't change. What happens is that the discourse adjusts itself in a kind of minor way. All right, manifest features might sort of mark some alterations, some things will be framed as exceptions, but whatever happens, the East remains framed as inferior to the West. Okay, so we're talking about basically, so I'll give you an example. So in the 5th chapter of my PhD thesis, I write about a Baptist missionary called James Peggs. And James Peggs is someone who has read a lot of books about Hindus and Hinduism, has certain deeply held preconceived notions about Hindus. This is the kind of latent or general ideas about the East, okay? And he sees many things happening which, in practice, which don't tally with these ideas. Now, rather than admit that you are wrong and thereby lose your hegemony in this relationship with the East, the discourse will manifest at a surface level, adjust itself to some extent. So James Pegg would say, okay, this is happening, but this doesn't mean I was wrong. It just means that this is an exception. This is an exception, and what I've always said, what the authorities have always said about the Hindus remains the truth. So this is basically flexible positional superiority. You can change, shift small things here and there, frame things as exceptions, but at the end of the day, it helps you maintain your superiority vis-a-vis the East. Okay, if you want more information on this particular thing, I can send you my PhD thesis. You can read, discuss it in some detail there. Moving on. Now, textualist bias also implies a kind of neutral or scientific nature of this knowledge. So what Said says is that Orientalist knowledge rarely expresses itself as a deeply felt experience. It presents itself as a neutral or scientific, a sort of statement of facts, a kind of list of facts about the East rather than a deeply felt experience. And this particular point is highly contestable. If you actually read Western writing, particularly by people who are in India, you do get the sense that India was a deeply felt experience. Anyway, what these widely diffused notions of the Orient depended on was the almost total absence in contemporary Western culture of the Orient as a genuinely felt and experienced force. As I've said, highly contestable. If you read the poetry of East India soldiers, you do get the sense that the Orient is genuinely felt and experienced. For a number of evident reasons, the Orient was always in the position both of outsider and of incorporated weak partner for the West. So you get a sense of the Orient as a kind of not thoroughly felt. There's a kind of absence of sympathy. There's a sense of detachment. And Said will discuss that there are types of narrative where you do get some sense of empathy and sympathy, which is basically fiction, narration. So he marks a kind of difference between narrated Orientalism and scientific Orientalism. There is more sympathy in the former, in narrated Orientalism, in fiction about India, for instance, than in scientific Orientalism. But basically the point that he's trying to make is that much of Orientalist knowledge tends to present itself as objective and as a kind of neutral and not deeply felt, in the same way that an atlas doesn't have feelings. If you're a cartographer, if you're making maps, you're not kind of particularly moved about what you're putting on the map. Similarly, Orientalists would write about the lazy, promiscuous Hindus as if they don't really deeply associate with it, as if it's a kind of objective fact which is not deeply. Yes, okay. So speaking for the Orient. So point number 3, Orientalism involves displacement, and this is what is revealed in the epigraph to Orientalism. There are 2 epigraphs. One is they cannot express themselves. They must be. They cannot represent themselves. They must be represented. This is Karl Marx from the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. And there is also the East is a Career, which is from Tancred by Disraeli. But so both of those are very significant for this particular point, which is that basically the idea is that the Orientals are not allowed to speak for themselves or represent themselves. They are spoken for. To the extent that Western scholars were aware of contemporary Orientals or Oriental movements of thought and culture, these were perceived as either silent shadows to be animated by the Orientalist, brought into reality by him, or as a kind of cultural and intellectual proletariat useful for the Orientalist's grander interpretive activity, necessary for his performance as superior judge, learned man, powerful cultural will. So the best example of this is William Jones, and the kind of broader British project of interpreting Hinduism. If you look at Charles Wilkins, Nathaniel Brassey Hallhead, later Colebrooke, and other Sanskritists, of course Max Müller, German scholar later on. What happens in the writings of these authors is that they show some awareness that there are indeed native bodies of thought, native Hindus, indigenous ideas of thought and culture, but these are not given enough of a voice. They are not allowed to represent themselves. They are animated by the Orientalists. So the take on Hinduism that you get is in the voice of the Orientalist. It's not allowing the native to speak. Can the subaltern speak? In this case, no. Okay. So the Oriental thinkers themselves, for instance, religious exegetes and scholars, would be framed as a kind of intellectual proletariat, so a kind of lower class, which is superseded by the Orientalists' grander interpretive activities. So the Orientalist has this kind of Olympian gaze. The Orientalist understands the Easterners' culture and religion better than they themselves do. That is the kind of suggestion, all right? Grander interpretive activity necessary for his performance as superior judge, learned man, powerful cultural will. The East is a career, as Benjamin Disraeli says in Tancred. This is again from Said. I mean to say that in discussions of the Orient is all absence, whereas one feels the Orientalist and what he says are as presence. Yet we must not forget that the Orientalist presence is enabled by the Orient's effective absence. So basically the point is that the Orient is less important than what the Orientalist makes of it. Okay, your culture, hey, let me tell you what your culture is. Alright, that's what I've done in this meme to the right. In time, the scholar's efforts in selection representation are forgotten and his Orient is taken as the Orient. Now that is the other problem. The problem is that people reading about the Orient would be unlikely to think of the Orient having an independent reality over and above what the scholar has presented. And of course, the representation is always, eo ipso selective. It is necessarily selective, reductive, and to some extent subjective. So William Jones' Orient is not the reality about India, if there is any such thing as a reality, but it is taken for it. All right, so that is the problem. Moving on, a couple of quick points here. Male discourse, corollary, Orient gendered as female. Orientalism itself, furthermore, was an exclusively male province. Like so many professional guilds during the modern period, it viewed itself and its subject matter with sexist blinders. So this is the point, that basically much of Orientalist activity, much of scholarly study of the Orient, even non-scholarly works, fiction, was written by men. Now this, by the way, recent scholarship has unearthed some female voices. So again, in my PhD thesis, I talk about some of them. Elizabeth Hamilton is one author, Belfast-born British author. Sydney Owenson, Irish woman. So there were, Mariah Sherwood. You can think about later examples in 19th century. So there were some Orientalists, even scholarly. You might say, Sydney Owenson. She really digs deep into her Orientalist material. She's in a sense an Orientalist, a professional, almost a professional in her own right when in what she writes about India. But the kind of stereotype that Said suggests, the kind of and this may be broadly speaking true, that in general most Orientalists were male. Not only were they male, they thought in male ways, all right, and they viewed the subject matter with sexist blinders. Moving on, timeless and voiceless, the idea that the Orient is eternal, uniform, incapable of defining itself. Therefore, it is assumed that a highly generalized and systematic vocabulary for describing the Orient from a Western standpoint is inevitable and scientifically objective. So, basically, the idea of the Orient as an unchanging place is it's eternal, it's uniform, and also unable to define itself, needing the Orientalists to speak for them. And therefore it supports the idea that a general, systematic and kind of scientific, therefore eternally unchanged vocabulary for or set of ideas about the Orient from a Western standpoint could be true for all of time. Feared and controlled, that the Orient is at bottom something either to be feared, the yellow peril, the Mongol hordes, the brown dominions, etc., or to be controlled by pacification, research and development, outright occupation whenever possible. So Orientalism is concomitant with fear of the other, fear of the unknown, and control. And here I'd like to mention, some other scholars who have criticized Western philosophy, Western ways of knowing other cultures along similar lines. If you look at Emmanuel Levinas's Totality and Infinity, he suggests that Western philosophy has been marked by this persistent totalizing tendency, all right, this tendency to deny the cultural other its separateness, its inability to withstand difference as difference, all right, a tendency to to either equate to the self or other, negate. Okay, again you see this in also Abdul Jan Muhammad has an important essay called The Economy of the Manichaean Allegory. Economy of the Manichaean Allegory. You can look into this. Again, he argues that in colonial discourse there's a tendency to either say that this cultural, this foreign culture is like us, or is totally other and totally alien, and therefore needs to be feared or controlled. Okay. Anyway, so you might want to look up Levinas's Totality and Infinity. You might want to look up Jan Muhammad's very important essay. It's there in the Post-Colonial Reader, called The Economy of the Manichaean Allegory. Incomplete or imperfect copy. In most Orientalist work since there has always lurked a value judgment decreeing the Oriental to be a discrete specimen of something resembling but never attempting the status of a normal, that is, Western white human being. So the Western white subject is framed as normative, and the Easterner is always some kind of inauthentic copy of, or some kind of inauthentic, something resembling but never attaining full normality of the white Western human being. And this is something, if you read Fanon, you'll really understand how this can feel like, this facing this kind of attitude. If you read his Black Skin, White Masks, for instance, it's a passionate outcry against the way in which he was not recognized, Fanon was not recognized as French enough. He comes from Algeria, which was under French control, and the book is about how in many ways he was taught to think like a French person, like a European. He was schooled in European ways, trained in European psychology, philosophy, etc., considered himself to be French and European in many ways, but when he goes to France, he is treated as a Negro. He is just treated as something resembling but not coming fully up to a Western white normative human being. All right, so read Fanon. It's very powerful. I read it in practically one sitting. It's such a powerful book. The Black White Masks. Okay, so that was the basic arguments made in Orientalism. Now we come to some problems that critics have pointed out with Said's thesis in Orientalism. Point number one, and this is the biggest paradox about the work in a nutshell. The problem is that Said is complaining against, is bemoaning an essentializing attitude, right? But in doing so, he himself is catering to the idea of an essential difference between East and West, and thereby helping to perpetuate the idea of an essential difference between East and West. Okay? This is from Chandrayani Yogi's book on Orientalism. She is a professor at Jadavpur, one of my favorite professors. She has a very good book on Orientalism, and she says his insistence on interpreting Orientalism as an ethnocentric discourse of superiority, essentially unsympathetic, even when it was laudatory and flattering to the Orient on occasions, seemed to have subverted his humanistic claims of erasing the Manichaean division between the West and the East. So, he claims to be a humanist, he claims to be working against this binary and essential difference between West and East, but you see, in saying that Westerners have always framed Easterners in this negative light, he himself is generalizing, he himself is essentializing, he himself is deeply rooted in the idea of a West and an East that can be separated, alright, that can be almost essentially different. Okay. Second problem, if power predetermines the way a cultural other is represented, how then do we account for the fact that negative stereotypes of the Orient predate Western material hegemony, that is colonialism, over the Orient? So the issue is that, look, one of the things that Said says is that your relationship of power vis-a-vis another culture will to some extent predetermine the kind of knowledge that you produce about this culture. Okay, so it might make sense that Western colonialism leads to negative stereotypes about the Orient. Your relationship of power is one of dominating over the Orient, therefore you produce negative stereotypes. But the thing is that you can find negative stereotypes about the Orient predating Western colonialism. So how do you explain it? If it's essentially power predetermining the kind of knowledge you produce, if power accounts for negative stereotyping, how do you explain negative stereotypes that existed before the West had any kind of hegemony, political or economic, over the East? So Said describes Orientalism as a discourse as old as Western civilization itself, as old as the writings of Diodorus Siculus. The ancient Greeks did not have any political hegemony or power over the East. How then do we explain essentialist attitudes in their writings? So that's one problem. Number 3, and this is again something specific that I am pointing out based on my own study. But for instance, what complicates early missionary Orientalist writing about India, say by Ziegenbalg or the Serampore trio, William Ward, William Carey, Joshua Marshman, is that power only problematically determines, or only to some limited extent determines, the focal length, as it were, of the disciplinary prison. I will explain this. Indians are stereotyped often negatively, but this is not underpinned by power. The Serampore trio eked out a very measly existence for decades and barely managed to survive. So then, do depictions of asymmetry between cultures necessarily have to depend on asymmetrical power relations? So what I'm trying to say here is that দেখো ব্যাপারটা হচ্ছে, at the time in which the Serampore trio established their mission in Srirampur, currently in Srirampur, they were at the fringes of empire. The British government did not support what they were doing. That's why they had to go to Danish territory. They were really struggling. There were very few of them. They had no material power as such. The local native culture was much more powerful. The religion was much more powerful. But nonetheless, even in their writings, you get certain depictions of Indians as stereotyped and essentially other. So, and what is this drawing on? Clearly, it's not drawing on colonial power or material power over the East. What it is arguably drawing on is Christian ideas about pagans, Christian negative stereotypes about pagan religions. So, the broader point that I'm trying to hint at is that negative stereotyping of any culturally different people need not be dependent only or mainly on colonial power or material hegemony over them. Other factors such as your religious discourse, philosophical discourse, other sets of ideas can feed into this process of stereotyping. Alright, Said suggests that it's basically certain types of material power that lead to stereotyping, but in fact, you can see that it's not necessarily the case, which you see with the Serampur trio, which you see even in ancient Greek writing. They didn't have material power, but they're still stereotyping. So, stereotyping can happen without this link to power. Okay? So, Orientalism suggests this kind of inevitable link between the process of stereotyping and hegemony, okay, of control, of power. But I am problematizing this. I am suggesting that maybe stereotyping can occur independent of, prior to, outside of asymmetrical relationships of power when it comes to colonial power. There can be other factors that lead to it. Other problems. Okay, now this is a very interesting and rich field of problematization. I'm going to sum this up before I inundate you with information. Basically, one thing that has been said about Said is that he is backward projecting 19th century attitudes about the East, which are indeed essentialist, which are indeed derogatory, which are indeed framing binary differences onto earlier kinds of writing. And this might be a mistake. And the best example to show you that this is a mistake is to look at the Enlightenment philosophers, French philosophers, British philosophers as well, several writers during the 18th century who were in fact not stereotyping the East, who were at least not negatively stereotyping the East, who were not in fact supportive of imperialism. Okay, so when Said says something like all Western writers have negatively stereotyped the East in support of colonial rule or material hegemony, the 18th century largely proves him wrong in some ways. There is a rich field of writing which does not display this 19th century attitude. So maybe Said is backward projecting, alright? So, problem number 3, how do we account for the plethora of texts by Europeans in colonial India that are deeply sympathetic, in fact, towards the plight of Indians and resist or challenge existing stereotypes? So, rich body of literature. I've already mentioned Sidney Owenson's The Missionary. I've already mentioned Elizabeth Hamilton's Letters of a Hindu Raja. To tell you a little bit more about Letters of a Hindu Raja, it's a kind of subgenre of Orientalist writing in which you would have this Oriental travelers. So, in Letters of a Hindu Raja, you have a Hindu who is traveling through Europe and he's observing facets of European culture which he misunderstands. He comically misunderstands them, but the satire is on Europeans. It is ridiculing their corruption, their irreligiosity, etc. For instance, this Hindu Raja who's traveling in Europe, he mistakes the European obsession with card games for religion. He thinks that they're praying. Such is their fervent dedication to the playing of card games. So you can see it's a satire. The butt of the satire is Europe, and its irreligiosity, its obsession with cards, its various aspects of an emerging capitalist commodity-oriented culture in the 18th century. But the point is that here is one example of a text that is not stereotyping the East, that is not simplistically supporting Western colonialism. It is to some extent, I'll explain that later. But the point is that Said's argument is somewhat simplistic. It flattens out the complexities of the discourse. And you can see this if you read certain 18th century writers on colonial India who are resisting or challenging stereotypes. Okay, is it possible to suggest that women writers were more sympathetic and less essentialist towards India than male writers? because of sympathy towards fellow sufferers under a hegemonic structure, in the women writers' case, patriarchy. So one argument that emerges amongst feminist writers, feminist critics, scholars who have studied these women writers of the 18th century is that, look, they felt a fellow feeling, they felt a sympathy for Hindus in India under British rule based on their own sufferings under patriarchal rule. So there is sympathy and identification rather than negation and kind of lack of empathy. Okay. So the problem here is that Said may be projecting 19th century European views of Asia onto more liberal periods. Many scholars have argued that the Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century, the philosophes Kant, Herder, Diderot, Voltaire, etc., were profoundly respectful, sympathetic, and even admiring of Asia. Now, Jürgen Osterhammel has a book on this called Unfabling the East. If you are interested, I have recently written a review in a Routledge journal called Postcolonial Studies. I've written a review of this book. Well, it's a very, very interesting book, and it's talking about the likes of Diderot, Voltaire. It's talking about various 18th century writers who were respectful, sympathetic, and even admiring of Asia. So, Osterhammel writes that the balance of power between Asia and Europe was matched in the mid-18th century. You remember that the Mughal Empire was profoundly powerful. By the 18th century, it was losing some of its power. But there were times in the history of Europe and Asia where there was not a completely asymmetrical relationship of power. So that's what Osterhammel is saying. The balance of power between Asia and Europe was matched in the 18th century, mid-18th century, during the flowering of liberal Enlightenment thought, was matched by an intellectual equilibrium that makes the thinking of this era far more attractive and lastingly significant than later triumphalist ideologies of the all-conquering West. So, Jürgen Osterhammel is saying that Said is backward projecting 19th century triumphalist ideologies onto earlier centuries, including the 18th century, which need not have been as triumphalist in its depiction of the East. Again, as G.S. Rousseau and Roy Porter, sorry, I should capitalize Porter there. Again, as G.S. Rousseau and Roy Porter stated, the mid-18th century, was also a moment when, because of the power of Enlightenment pens, Europe itself was sufficiently self-critical and free from bigotry to be able to confront other cultures, admittedly not as equals, nor even necessarily on their own terms, but at least as alternative versions of living. For a brief moment before the logic of the white man's mission required that they be subordinated, eviscerated, and destroyed. So in this book, Exoticism in the Enlightenment, Rousseau and Porter basically talk about Western fascination for Asia as providing alternative versions of living, viable alternatives. In many ways, talking about this kind of noble savage in some cases, okay, someone, the Eastern society as different but better in some ways, okay. So that's partly what you get in this book. Again, over here you have a little quote on Denis Diderot and Herder. Two passionate critics of European colonialism, Diderot and Herder, believed that colonialism violated nature because it ultimately destroyed or reduced the cultural variety. Nature intended such cultures to remain independent. Hence, both authors went so far as to condemn, sorry, there's some typo there, went so far as to condemn European travel to other cultures because of its negative effects on them. So basically, Diderot and Herder espoused a kind of cultural relativism. And a lot of 18th century thinkers espoused a kind of cultural relativism. This means that they considered other cultures to be, to have their own status, to have their own importance, to be independent of. They were basically not, they were relativistic about. They said, okay, each to their own, essentially. All right. Diderot and Herder being examples. So that's the bigger point then, is that Said may be backward projecting triumphalist ideologies of the 19th century onto a far more relativistic 18th century. Okay, moving on. Now we are going to talk about how sympathy, but so what? So That is colonialism really premised on necessarily unsympathetic images or negative stereotypes or not identifying with the East? So Said is suggesting constantly that colonialism works by not sympathizing, by negatively stereotyping, not identifying. But actually, if you read again 18th century British Orientalism, you'll see that often there is sympathy, there is identification with the East. But interestingly, this becomes the premise for supporting British rule. Okay, so colonialism need not always be premised on unsympathetic images, negative stereotypes, or not identifying. In fact, it could be undergirded or perpetuated by sympathetic images, positive stereotypes, and identifying with the East. Okay, so let's see. This is from Chandra Neogi's book again, Orientalism as Said formulated it. Fails to explain how processes of ontological identification with the East were equally, if not more, conducive to imperialistic practice, particularly in delivering the Hindus from the despotic Muslim yoke into the hands of a paternalistic system of British government. Okay, so this is what's happening in a lot of books, including Elizabeth Hamilton's Letters of a Hindu Raja. What you see happening simultaneously is an identification between the Western culture, Western writer, and Hindus. So the idea is that you Hindus are in many ways like us. You have an ancient scripture, you have a noble set of ideas in your religion. So there is sympathy and there's identification. But what this means is that, hey, you guys are suffering under these despotic Mughal rulers. Let us deliver you of this. We will give you better governance, better rule. So simultaneously you have colonialism championed and not negative stereotypes, not unsympathetic images, but sympathetic images. Alright? So the basic point is that sympathy for the East could support colonialism just as much as a lack of sympathy. Okay, so Said's idea that Orientalism is a discourse based on negative stereotypes and not identifying, both of which would serve to justify colonialism, is reductive, because many times colonialism is justified by identifying with certain sectors of the ruled country. So sympathetic representations of Hindus as mild and gentle, as opposed to the allegedly despotic and tyrannical Islamic ruling class, were thus instrumental in justifying a benevolent British paternalism. They act as what Michel Foucault would call an incitement to discourse, enjoining Britain to play St. George, as it were, to the Muslim dragon through the production of power knowledge. This is again from my PhD thesis. Said can be criticized for his excessive reliance on sympathy as the redeeming feature of cultural studies, and his inability to historicize sympathy itself as an 18th century political economic ethic. So Neogi is talking about basically sensibility. Within the literary culture of sensibility, which you're studying in your pre-romantic movement, there is a lot of support for marginal figures, a lot of support for the underprivileged, for the people who are facing difficult circumstances. So there is this cult of sensibility and sympathy, which was a product of 18th century literature, and it wasn't necessarily emancipatory. In many ways it could justify colonial rule, just as it did in India, by suggesting that the Hindus are a mild and gentle people oppressed by Islamic rulers who need to be displaced. Okay, so there are many examples of sympathy and identification rather than negation. Elizabeth Hamilton, for instance. However, these do not necessarily negate colonialism. Hamilton staunchly supports British rule in India while being sympathetic towards Hindu. In fact, sympathy and identification with Hindus is the very basis for her support of imperialism. Her suggestion is that British rule will be a benevolent paternalism. Okay, let's move on. Okay, now we come to the we come to certain post-colonial scholars and their problems and their sort of the ways in which they take Said forward and make his, suggest that Orientalism is much more complex than what Said suggests it is. Now, first, a bigger philosophical question. Arguably, no object of knowledge can exist outside of, that is to say, have an ontological independence of the particular epistemic framework that defines a body of knowledge. Okay, what do I mean? What I mean is that we never really see the world without some kind of glasses on. Okay, you can see Homi Bhava to the right, he's got glasses on. Think about it that way. There is, it is very hard to posit an unmediated knowledge of any other culture. We always get to know it through particular bodies of knowledge, pre-existing bodies of knowledge. So, is Orientalism, is this kind of stereotyping that you see in Orientalism, is it an inevitable human tendency? That is to say, we're asking, is it at all possible to know and understand other cultures independent of the frameworks of understanding that we inherit? So when Said is indicting Western culture for doing this, hey, is that fair? Don't all cultures stereotype other cultures? Wouldn't it be interesting to see how Indians wrote about Westerners at this time? Wouldn't we also be stereotyping them as sahibs and behaving in certain peculiar ways? Basically, is it at all possible to engage with radically different cultures independent of the frameworks of understanding that we inherit? We are always in some way biased or trained to look at them in a particular way. Okay? So why indict Western civilization particularly for this? Why even suggest it is a peculiarly Western habit? It could be a universal habit. And here I want to mention a very interesting essay by the scholar Laura Bohannon called Shakespeare in the Bush. Please read it. It's a delightful, funny read. And what Laura Bohannon does is, she's an anthropologist. She's studying the tribe, a kind of tribal people of Nigeria called the Tiv people, T-I-V, the Tiv people of Nigeria. And she is trying to understand cultural difference. And what she proposes is to tell them the story of Hamlet. Shakespeare, of course, known as the great humanist. There is this idea that Shakespeare is widely understood and loved because he appeals to something universal in human nature. The themes that he explores are universal human themes, revenge in Hamlet, procrastination in Hamlet, action and its consequences in Macbeth, for instance, jealousy in Othello. Surely these are great universal themes that everyone will understand. So that is the kind of humanist understanding of Shakespeare, complicated, of course, by the kind of post-colonial suggestion that it's really through colonialism that Shakespeare is universalized. It's not, there is no essential kind of humanism that he taps into. But the point is that Laura Bohannon goes to this tribe in Nigeria, goes with the story of Hamlet and says, okay, let's see if Shakespeare is really a universal humanist and if they understand Hamlet the same way that we do. And what happens is a bizarre process of misreading. She sits with them, she smokes with them, she drinks their liquor, and she tells them the story of Hamlet, and they're all getting along, they're having a chat about Hamlet. And the Tiv people of Nigeria are perplexed by Hamlet. Firstly, when she tells them the story of Hamlet, they say, why should Claudius not, why should Gertrude not marry her husband's brother? That is a natural thing to do. So, of course, if you read Hamlet, you get this deep sense of unease about the fact that Hamlet Sr. has died, his wife has immediately gone and married his brother, which it suggests that it's a kind of incestuous relationship almost. There's something wrong about overcoming the grief of her husband's passing so quickly and also marrying her brother. It's almost incestuous. But this is the done thing in the Tiv people of Nigeria. This is the expected behavior. When your husband dies, you go and marry his brother immediately. And that is what's normal in their culture. So they are perplexed by this situation in Hamlet. Why should Gertrude not marry her husband's brother? Secondly, they are perplexed as to why Hamlet would want to kill his uncle. Again, this is not something that's done in Tiv culture. There's this profound taboo against any kind of violence against an older male figure in your family. So they said that if indeed Hamlet had some cause for revenge, if his uncle was the killer of his father, he should have appealed to other people outside his family to do the murder. How dare Hamlet try to kill his uncle? This is wrong. And finally, they understand Hamlet's going mad as witchcraft. Hamlet is going mad not because of his problematic relationship with Ophelia, not because of his inability to act. They think it's witchcraft because in their culture, madness is the result of witchcraft. So basically, I'm talking about this essay at length because, Laura Bohannon's essay Shakespeare on the Bush suggests that cultures interpret things from their own frameworks of understanding, and misunderstanding of cultures is inevitable. We cannot perhaps know a radically different culture without thinking through their culture using the lens, using the frameworks of understanding that we inherit from our own culture. Okay? Next point, I'm getting a bit tired here. It's almost been 2 hours of continuous talking, so I'll try to wrap this up. There's just 2 or 3 more slides. Actually, I'll take a little break here. I'm going to pause this again and hope that it doesn't get destroyed. I'll be back. Okay, I'm back. Again, hopefully there should be no issues with the recording. Moving on. Said is talking mainly about the Islamic Middle East in Western eyes, but his thesis has been universalized to apply to all Western accounts of all Asia. Sorry, there's a word missing there. It might be worth remembering that Said bases these generalizations about Western discourse mainly on works on Islam. Here he writes about Islam in a way that makes the difference with works on Hindus quite clear. There is an unbroken tradition in European thought of profound hostility, even hatred towards Islam as an outlandish competitor. One finds it in Dante, who placed Muhammad in the 8th circle of the Inferno, and Voltaire in Renan, etc. The point is that Said's arguments are mainly based on reading British and French accounts of the Islamic Middle East. Now, it so happens that because of the history between Islam and Christianity, because of the way in which Islam, broke away from, the other books of the other Abrahamic faiths, because of things like the Crusades, the bloody history between Islam and Christendom, as it was then called, Islam has been vilified. Islam and Islamic cultures have been portrayed with hostility and hatred ever since as early as, for instance, Dante. Because Muhammad was framed as some kind of impostor, okay, as a fake messiah, and put in the 8th circle of the Inferno. So, is it, and the problem is that this this set of conclusions that he draws about Western representations of the Islamic Middle East gets generalized, gets broadened, is applied to all Western accounts of all of Asia, and perhaps that is inaccurate. This hostility that Said outlines is there, but it's particularly there in Western accounts of Islam and Islamic cultures, not so much certainly about Hindus, towards whom, from my own personal readings, I can tell you they were far more sympathetic. Okay, now a kind of problem that has been outlined by the subsequent history of post-colonial studies, which Said institutes in a sense, but other scholars such as Homi Bhabha have gone on to suggest that colonialism is far more ambivalent than Said suggests. So, Orientalism is a much more fraught discourse than what Said suggests. One may always read for and find resistance in them. Here I will be quoting from my thesis where I discuss this in my conclusion. And I'm talking about my own reading of 18th century Orientalist texts. The will to power that Said and Inden, that's Ronald Inden, who follows a Saidian method in his book called Imagined India. The will to power that Said and Inden critique does not always... Oops, sorry, that's my phone ringing. Just give me a second. Where was I? So, yeah, the will to power that Said and Indian critique does not always emerge triumphant in my readings of Orientalist texts. So, let me pause here and tell you what I did in my thesis. You see, I read these texts in a sense against the grain, and the texts themselves, the texts lend themselves to this kind of interpretation. You see, you often find that in the very process of making a kind of mythic statement about Western superiority over the East, in this will to power, in the very process of exerting this will to power, these texts deconstruct themselves. So, for instance, you have authors trying to absorb Asia into a universalizing Western narrative which prioritizes the West over the East, but in so doing, it reveals the limitations of itself. It fractures in a sense. All right. Um, it reveals that the East is often a kind of aporia, a kind of philosophical impasse which the Western author is struggling to absorb within his totalizing cogito. Okay, the Western author is trying to absorb the East into a framework, into his own framework, into his own set of assumptions and understandings, but it seems as if the East resists. It seems as if the East emerges as a kind of textual difficulty, a kind of aporia, one that shows that the will to power in these texts is not always triumphant. Okay, so I have sought throughout my thesis to foreground the ambivalence of colonial discourse, and this is kind of what Bhabha does as well, Bhabha, to outline epistemological limits, tensions, and paradoxes, and to suggest that compromise and failure are internal to the economy of imperial knowledge. It seems that the elaborations, and here I'm quoting Leela Gandhi, it seems that the elaborations of Cogito to reduce the unintelligible diversity and material alterity of the world to familiar contents often fails in its own totalizing project. Again, you can refer to my thesis for a kind of more detailed outline of the nuances and complications in Orientalist discourse that Said's argument flattens out. And of course, Homi Bhabha is someone whose career is built on suggesting that colonial discourse is more complex, more ambivalent, marked by by hybridity, and by mimicry. And we'll discuss these by and by, because I will be taking a separate class for both PG1 and my PhD batch on Homi Bhabha. I'll be looking very closely at Science Taken for Wonders. Anyway, moving on. Here you have Homi Bhabha to the right, top right, suggesting colonialism is a much more fraught, complex, hybrid, and contested discourse. Here you have Ranajit Guha and the Subaltern Studies group, who wrote the subaltern back into the national movement and suggested subaltern agency despite the hegemonic Orientalist discourse. So that's another problem with Said. He seems to frame the Eastern subject as kind of powerless. Alright, and these figures such as Bhabha and Guho have tried to reassert agency for the Eastern subject even within colonial discourse. Moving on. This is a kind of not that big a deal, but in some ways what Said does, and let me just sum it up before you read this barrage of information. This book, Orientalism, changes the meaning of the word Orientalism and essentially confuses us. Now there are so many meanings to the word Orientalism, it's kind of difficult to kind of agree on what exactly it means, because Said changes the meaning of Orientalism. Essentially, in a nutshell, it used to mean a professional scholar of the Orient, simply that, with no value judgment, but now it's become a kind of byword for racism, for basically a kind of cultural bias or essentialist attitude of a Westerner towards the East. So the meaning has changed. And there's a third meaning as well, so I'll come to that. So Orientalism has made the term Orientalism ambiguous. Part of the confusion relating to the term Orientalism arises from the fuzzy, often overlapping meanings Edward Said endows it with in his Orientalism. He gives Orientalism at least two meanings. First, the older one, an academic study of the Orient, and second, a style of thought based upon an ontological and epistemological distinction made between the Orient and most of the time the Occident. That is an essentialist attitude in Western observers when representing Asia. An attitude Said reads into the entire history of Western literature. So suddenly we have multiple meanings for the word Orientalism. What does it mean? Does it mean a scholar of the Orient, or does it mean someone who has an essentialist attitude towards Asia? Does it mean both of them at the same time? What are the problems if you conflate this? Does it mean that every professional scholar of the Orient had such an essentialist attitude towards Asia, which is reductive? All right. There is vexingly a third meaning of the term Orientalism, one current in Britain in the last decades of the 18th century and in scholarship of the period. It referred, in debates surrounding the British role in India, to a conservative and romantic approach to the problems of government faced by the officials of the East India Company. The Orientalists, in this third sense, would soon square up to their contestants, the Anglicists, whose attitude, typified by Thomas Babington Macaulay's Minute on Indian Education towards India, was the polar opposite. The latter advocated a strident interventionism in affairs of culture, education and religion. So this is a kind of, there's a third meaning to Orientalism, which is one that is not so current. These days we don't think about it in this sense, but in British India in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, an Orientalist was one who had basically a soft attitude towards the East. Someone who said we should not interfere too much with their religion, we should not interfere too much with their culture. And opposed to these thinkers were Anglicists. Anglicists who, like Thomas Babington Macaulay, suggested a kind of strident interventionism. Said we should change them, we should Anglicize them, we should make them more like us. So there were two camps, people like William Jones who said let them be, let their culture be, they were kind of relativistic, conservative and romantic approach to the government attitude towards India. And you had the Anglicists who suggested the opposite, strident interventionism. So at least three meanings to Orientalism. One, professional scholar of the Orient. Two, a style of kind of essentialized thinking. And three, there is that local 18th century sense of Orientalist as someone with a kind of conservative attitude towards company rule in India. So it's a very confusing. So Said contributes to making the word Orientalism kind of fuzzy and complicated. When someone now says X is an Orientalist, do they mean scholar of the Orient, or racist, or someone who stereotypes Asians? This is never clear. Within academic circles, it's more likely to be the latter. So now if you are someone who studies South Asia, you call yourself a South Asianist. You don't call yourself an Orientalist, because Said has has so much changed the connotations of the word that it's become a kind of pejorative term. It's a word insulting. You're an Orientalist means you have a kind of biased, essentializing, racist attitudes towards Easterners. So nobody uses the term Orientalist to describe what they're doing anymore. If you're in Chicago University, you're doing South Asian studies, then you're a South Asianist. Okay, William Jones is certainly an Orientalist in senses 1 and 3, but what about 2? Is he also essentializing India? Difficult question. If you see Garland Cannon's work on Jones, it will present you with a quite different portrait than what Said gives us. Okay. Finally, and I'm quite tired here, we were nearly done. We are going to talk about historians and why historians have a problem with Said. Mainly, and to put it very simply, they have a problem with his methodological bracketing out of truth content. They have a problem with his blindness to truth content. So Said condemns Orientalist discourse. He condemns it as a kind of Western racism, essentialism, without any interest in its veracity or lack thereof. That is, in its truth content. Are these statements, did they have any truth? You know, that disturbing part of this lecture where I was talking about this thalawati banging and how, to me it resonates with certain deep features of Indian culture. personality cults, thinking in collectives, religious frenzy. A lot of Orientalists in the 18th and 19th centuries would have said similar things. But was there not a grain of truth in what they said? Said is not interested in that. Said condemns it, pans all of it, without exploring whether these scholars were actually, in fact, drawing on their experiences and to some extent telling the truth about the East. Okay, so this blindness to truth content is a problem. Society condemns Orientalist discourse without any interest in its veracity or lack thereof. So one scholar who's criticized this is Thomas Trotman. In his Clash of Chronologies, he bemoans what he calls the programmatic indifference to the truth value of knowledge in scholarly works that have examined Indological texts from a Foucauldian Saidian perspective. So the Foucauldian program of examining the power-knowledge nexus brackets out questions of truth value, and this methodological bracketing out or blindness carries over through Said into colonial studies. So not only does Trotman, who is a rigorous historian, not only does Troutman criticize Said, he is critical of post-colonial studies in general. Because you see, post-colonial studies is to some extent infected with this genealogical method, this method which is simultaneously condemning something without investigating if it's true or not. And historians don't like that. Historians have a commitment to what is, even now after the post-structural turn, where there's some skepticism as to whether there is any single truth within language, even so there is some commitment to, okay, if an Orientalist has said this, were Middle Eastern people lazy? Would they sleep in the afternoon? Perhaps it's because of opium cultures, perhaps because of the weather, because the extreme heat. Maybe people did actually fall asleep in the afternoon. But who's going to investigate that? Said is not bothered. Said just makes this claim one of many symptoms of a Western malaise, a Western hatred for the East, without asking, hey, is there any grain of truth in this stuff that's being said? Okay, this may not have been so much of a problem if the negligence of truth content did not coexist with a totally condemnatory attitude. You may be the greatest, most meticulous, most objective white historian of Asia, but you would be dismissed as Orientalist simply because of your acknowledged or unacknowledged allegiance with an imperialist nation, by being born in or working in an American European university. So that's the problem. Another thing that emerges from this Saidian, from this post-colonial mode of analysis, is a profound skepticism to the possibility of any Western scholar of the East producing reliable or non-hegemonic, non-imperialist knowledge. The dog is going crazy. My neighbor's dog. What is your problem, dog? I'm trying to take a lecture. Wait, I'm waiting for Bruno the... Bruno is also a critic of Said, it seems. Yeah, he's shutting up now. Hey, Bruno's had enough of this lecture. It's gone on for 2 hours 17. Bruno, this is impossible. I'm just going to continue. You just have to ignore that dog. Anyway, so there is this kind of scorn, the skepticism within post-colonial studies of any knowledge produced within an imperialist country. Okay, you are tainted. The knowledge that you have produced is tainted by your being a part of an imperialist nation, and this is coming through Said to some extent. But is this doing a disservice to some white scholars? I mean, some of the most phenomenal works produced about India have been by Western scholars. And Wendy Doniger, this is a big debate. We can get into this, you can look it up in your own time, but read about people like Wendy Doniger, read about Sheldon Pollock, and read about how people in the right in India, for instance, Paranjpe, my former supervisor, condemn the knowledge they produce. They're white, so it's wrong, bad. But one of the things that Wendy Doniger writes in her introduction to the Hindus and alternative history is that, if you had to write a book about elephants, would you get the elephant to write the book, or would you get someone else to write the book? In a sense, being a cultural outsider might give you some distance, some critical distance that is necessary to produce knowledge that aspires towards objectivity. Right? You might, if you are so steeped in your own culture, particularly if you are religiously fervent, very deeply religious, can you write about your own religion in an objective way? Can you produce knowledge about your own religion that that is beyond the blinkers of your own culture? Okay, so think about these things. So, historians who hate Said: number one, Thomas Trotman, see Clash of Chronologies, Aryans and British India. Number two, Jürgen Osterhammel, see Unfabling the East, or my review of it in Postcolonial Studies. And you see, I can understand these people, they spend their entire lives. If you look at Wendy Doniger, she's a fantastic scholar. She's read deeply, deeply, deeply in Sanskrit literature. The problem is that ever since Said, people throw eggs at her. Every time she goes to a conference in India, people just throw eggs at her because she is an Orientalist. She is, the knowledge she produces is tainted in their eyes by her location in a Western country. So, eagerly need to bow. Moving on, and this is the final slide. We will look at one particular scholar's very detailed critique of Orientalism. So, David Smith wreaks havoc on Said in this particular essay called Orientalism and Hinduism. See the Blackwell Companion to Hinduism by Gavin Flood. In Orientalism, Said introduced and popularized the ideas of Foucault. I should have italicized Orientalism there, sorry. Although partly inspired by Raymond Schwab's La Renaissance Orientale, which makes India the centerpiece of an expected cultural rebirth of Europe through the study of the Orient, Sanskrit performing the role of Greek in the first Renaissance, Said is principally concerned with the Arab world and its treatment by the West. European novels remain his primary area of expertise, and not for a moment does he take on board Schwab's thesis that the East has influenced the West. So again, what David Smith is talking about here is the way in which Said's rather myopic focus on the Arab world as represented by French and British Orientalism has been universalized, has been taken as emblematic of a broader tendency, when in fact, if you look at things like Raymond Schwab's La Renaissance Orientale, he talks about how much in love with the East, how pro-East many Western Orientalists were, how genuinely interested they were, how humane their knowledge was in many ways, and how deeply indebted the West is to the East. Alright, so these things get written out, these things get neglected by Said's somewhat reductive monolithic argument. Okay, so Smith has basically methodological issues with Said. He says that Said makes use of Foucault's notion of discourse, of a manner of thinking that is adopted willy-nilly by a generation or more of writers, while at the same time having as his preferred procedure the literary analysis of individual works of literature. So again, he has a problem here. He says that, look, Said is someone who is trained in literary analysis. His background is in English literature, comparative literature, and he's doing basically close readings of particular literary texts. Now, does that indeed give one a genuine understanding of a broader Western tendency when it comes to thinking about the East? Okay, can you make a generalization about an entire discourse based on merely studying a couple of literary works very closely? So that's a methodological issue that he raises. You must read this essay because I get the sense that Smith is basically really irked because he's a possibly a closet apologist for empire. University of Lancaster, he's not at all happy with Said, and it's stemming partly because it's a personal attack. Many scholars of the East, Western scholars of the East, feel that Said is personally attacking them, is invalidating their entire discipline simply because they are white. Okay, final slide, just to finish the David Smith point. So he says, a significant and malign maneuver on Said's part is to extend the term Orientalist from students of Oriental languages to all those who deal with the Orient, whether or not they use texts in the original languages. His final option for the meaning of Orientalism is, of course, turns it on its head. As taken up by the sociologist Brian Turner, Orientalism means ignorance of the Orient. From the 17th century onwards, Orientalism had constituted a profound sense of otherness with respect to alien cultures. So, what David Smith is saying is that, look, here are these people, these Orientalists, who have spent their entire lives. And if you look at people like William Jones, it's astounding. If you look at Carrie Ward Marshman, they genuinely were interested in Indian culture. They genuinely read, deeply understood, were well versed inside, and they knew about the East. They knew about Orientalism. But what has happened as an after effect of Said's book Orientalism is that now Orientalism means a kind of ignorance towards the Orient, a kind of thinking through stereotypes, not thinking rigorously, profound sense of otherness with respect to alien cultures. And this is such a disservice to entire generations of scholars. Max Muller, there's a Max Muller Bhabon in India. There are people who have spent their lives studying the Orient. And is it fair to tar them with the brush of being Orientalists, which in a sense means ignoring the Orient or being, blind to its empirical, to empirical observations about the Orient? Okay, so this perverse sleight of hand magics away into thin air the editions, translations, and dictionaries of the true and original Orientalists who devoted their lives to understanding the meaning of instances of Oriental culture and civilization. Okay, so that brings us to an end of our discussion of Orientalism. I've done it very, very closely and in great detail. Exhausted. So if you have any doubts, please email me, or don't email me. My inbox is completely flooded with emails right now. I'm really struggling. But as I've said, just a couple of pointers for revision. This is a very important book. Read the introduction, buy the book if you can, or just read the PDF that I gave you. Read your class notes, listen to this lecture, go through. If you want, I can send you the PPT separately. I think you already have the PPT, but this video is based on the PPT, so know these issues well. What is Orientalism? What are the main tenets of Orientalism according to Said? What are the stereotypes that Westerners supposedly had about the East? What is the Foucauldian basis of Said's ideas? And finally, what are some of the problems with Said's arguments in Orientalism? Okay, that's us done. See you later. Goodbye. Have a nice day, etc.